Thank
you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am so pleased to be here with you all for the third and our final series on Japanese Latin Americans during World War II. This series has explored many interesting questions and is paired to complement the exhibit at the Milwaukee Jewish Museum on the Japanese American experience here in the United States with internment. So it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and names, folks who have joined us for previous parts of our series. If you are joining us for the first time today, you can find our other presentations by Dr. Jerry Garcia and Dr. Natasha Werner on our YouTube channel. We'll be sure to post those links in the chat in a few minutes. But this afternoon, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jeffrey Lesser, who is a professor of history at Emory University. He is written extensively on the Japanese diaspora and Japanese Latin Americans with a focus on Brazilian ethnic identity. He's written many books on the topic of Japanese Brazilians. And so it's really a pleasure to have him here today with us to share his expertise on the questions of the experiences of Japanese Brazilians during the 1930s to 54 period. So with that, we'll keep it brief. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I've asked Dr. Lesser to talk for about half an hour, and then he will open it up to questions. So you can reserve your questions to the end or put them in the chat. And I look forward to seeing the rest of you after he gives his talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Natasha?
I can.
It's really nice to be here, both here where I'm sitting, which is Sao Paulo, Brazil, and here with you all. Before I start talking about Japanese Brazilians and Japanese immigration to Brazil, since this program has a relationship between the Japanese diaspora and the Jewish diaspora, I want to just mention quickly about how I came to do this research, because it'll also give you some insight into how I think about these questions. My first book was on, well, I thought it was on Jewish immigration to Brazil, but it quickly turned out to be a book that asked the question, how come the Brazilian government banned Jewish entry at the end of the 1930s to Brazil, and then more Jews proceeded to enter Brazil openly as Jews than ever before? That was my question. And as many people do in ethnic studies, myself included, we tend to imagine that the group that we're looking at is quite exceptional and unique. And all of the kind of questions and methods involved in our research takes that approach. And I did that in that project. And so I developed a theory about the unique place of Jews in Brazil, and that was fine. Someplace in the midst of doing this work, I received a email, I guess, from Albert Hirani, who, the late Albert Hirani, who at the time was head of the Center for Lebanese Studies at Oxford University. And for those of you who don't know, Albert Hirani is kind of considered one of the parents of Arab diaspora studies. And Hirani contacted me and said, I'm preparing a book on the Lebanese diaspora. I want you to write a chapter about Brazil. And at the time, I responded initially in that classic inward-looking way. And I said, Dr. Hirani, I'm sorry. I study Jews, not Arabs. Those are two different things. I can't do it. And at least as I remember the conversation, Dr. Hirani, at the time a very famous person with an English accent, and me, a young punk with the accent that you're hearing now, that English accent said to me something like, when I ask you to do something, your only answer is yes, figure it out, kid. And off I went. And what I was stunned to discover, and I was stunned because it showed my own errors in thinking, was that a great deal of the material that I had about Jewish Brazilians was actually about Arab Brazilians and Japanese Brazilians as well. And I started to think about why were these groups among many people seen as one in the Brazilian context. So throughout this talk today, you're going to perhaps hear some comparisons that don't fit in with a traditional diaspora approach, which tends to see diasporas as disaggregated from each other. Let's start at the beginning. How do Japanese immigrants come to Brazil? Well, I said, let's start at the beginning. There we go. So Japanese immigration to Brazil comes as part of a very broad set of immigration to Brazil that starts around 1880, which is around the time when slavery is abolished in Brazil. Slavery is abolished. Brazil is the last country in Brazil to abolish slavery. And one way in which the racism of slavery continued well after slavery ended was in the assumption by many members of the Brazilian elite that ex-slaves, now free Brazilians, were incapable of doing plantation work or industrial work. And so the Brazilian government, which was made up largely of planters and industrialists, began to seek to bring immigrants into Brazil in large numbers. Those immigrants initially came from Portugal, Italy, and Spain. And the chart in front of you gives a sense of those numbers, which are huge, and how important those three groups are. But over the course of the late 19th century, planters started to believe, landowners started to believe, that European immigrants weren't so good after all because they were too involved in labor activism. And so they began looking for other immigrant groups to bring. And again, within this concept of broad ideas about racism, one of the ideas that came up was Japanese workers. There was an idea in Brazil at the time that Japanese were docile and thus would be something like laborers who weren't slaves but would act like slaves. They could be treated like slaves. That idea came at the same time that the United States created or passed the Gentleman's Agreement, as they called it at the time, which prohibited much Japanese immigration to the United States. So these two things came together. And so in 1908, you get the first ship bringing immigrants from Japan to Brazil. And as you can see, is by looking at the 1910 to 19, 1920 to 29, and 1930 to 39 bars, Japanese immigrants become very, very, very significant portions of the immigrants entering into Brazil. Here's another way of looking at the same thing. And what I want to really emphasize here, because you've heard about other countries in Latin America where the numbers of Japanese immigrants and their descendants are relatively small vis-a-vis the total population. In Brazil, the numbers of immigrants from Japan are very large, and the population that calls itself of Japanese descent is huge. As you can see, for example, currently, there are more people of Japanese descent in Brazil than there are in the United States, for example. So this is a really important part of understanding what happens during World War II, because it's a population, the immigrant population and the immigrant descent population have both a size and an economic and political power that isn't found in other countries in the Americas. Now, why does Japan care about Brazil? What are they interested in sending people to Brazil? First of all, without a doubt, they're interested in finding a place to send immigrants that isn't the United States. This was in part based on an idea that historians today don't entirely buy, but an idea that was really strongly held in early 20th century Japan, that Japan was under intense land pressure from its population. And so the government had to find a way to export its people elsewhere. One of the primary locations after the United States was shut down became Brazil, because there were huge amounts of land. Plantation owners were looking for workers to replace Europeans. And the government seemed particularly favorable to Japanese entry, especially as racist policies, explicitly racist policies, were being enacted in other parts of the Americas. One thing that stands out in Brazil compared to much of the other countries in the Americas to this day is that people of Asian descent are among many sectors of society considered white, and in some sectors of society considered whiter than Europeans. So, for example, in 1935, the House of Deputies in Brazil actually had a debate about whether subsidies should be given to Portuguese immigrants or Japanese immigrants. And the vote was in favor of Japanese immigrants, who, as the speaker said at the time, Japanese are clearly whiter than Portuguese. So as we're having this conversation today, I want you to think of whiteness in Brazil, not only as a color term, but a term related to things like economic power, global power, Japan as a global power and what that means, and political power. Many Japanese, most Japanese immigrants who came to Brazil went to work in rural areas. Initially, in 1908, and for about the next decade, those rural areas were owned by members of the Brazilian elite, and had been plantations in which the work was done by slaves. However, the immigrants themselves, coming from Imperial Japan, coming from a country that had won the Russian-Japanese War, coming from a country that had a kind of nationalist self-image as a world power, really were not willing to put up with being treated in slave-like ways. They weren't slaves, but they were treated very poorly on the plantations. And so very quickly, the Japanese government began removing immigrants from Brazilian-owned plantations and buying plots of land through a kind of public-private Japanese corporation that was set up, which would buy huge plots of land in Brazil, create colonies, and this is where the immigrants would go. This is an example of one of those colonies. Again, if we think through the logic, it makes sense. The Japanese government has an intense motivation to keep the immigrant streams going. Clearly, that's not going to happen if the word gets back to Japan that going to Brazil is terrible. And so by creating these new colonies that are owned by the Japanese government, which have Japanese schools on them, which are functioning in a kind of, I don't want to say Japanese way, but a Japanized way, they're able to keep the immigrant stream going. These Japanese agricultural colonies were an incredible success economically. Brazil, for example, goes from being an importer of rice in 1908 to an exporter of rice in 1920, with large amounts of that rice going to Japan. So again, when we think of Japanese immigration, we have to put it in this globalized context. It's not just a bunch of people go someplace, but there are all these other factors going on. Coffee becomes another very important transit product between Brazil and Japan. And so if you go and read about the history of coffee in Japan, Brazil is very important to that. In fact, if you go to contemporary Japan, you'll notice how many coffee houses are called things like Café São Paulo, Café Paulista, etc. That kind of cultural idea of coffee in Japan still exists. Of Brazilian coffee in Japan. Of course, not all Japanese immigrants went to the countryside or stayed in the countryside. And over the course of the 20th century, growing numbers of people are living in urban areas, especially in the state of Sao Paulo, but also in other places like Pará, which is an Amazonian state in the north, and Paraná, which is to the south of Sao Paulo state, and Mato Grosso do Sul, which is on the border with Bolivia. And all of these places, if you were to visit them today, have very sizable populations of Japanese descent. So over the course of the 20th century, what you have is some people immigrating directly to urban areas and a generation of Brazilian-born children of Japanese immigrants moving into cities to get educated. This is a very typical pattern that we see among Japanese immigrant and Japanese Brazilian families, where there are a group of children, one child takes over the agricultural area, one child is sent into the city to get educated, etc. And I mention this split because it becomes crucial for the World War II era, in that people of Japanese descent have very different ideas and understandings of World War II and Brazil's place in it, depending if they're rural or urban. So let's set that stage up. So in 1930, Brazil began to have a government which had fascist tendencies and which would remain in power until 1945. This government was tightly aligned with Germany and Italy and to some extent Japan, in part because of immigration and intense economic connections. There was also a belief among some members of this government that Brazil should emulate Japan both as a fascist country and as an ordered country. So the relations are politically tight as the World War II era begins. Over the initial years of World War II, Brazil remained officially neutral, having relations with everybody. But in 1942, that began to change. And what changed was that the president of Brazil, the president, you might call, some people would call him a dictator. He had been democratically elected and then overthrew himself in a coup d'etat. You may have heard about this from the previous speaker discussing contemporary Peru, because this was a version of what Fujimori did more recently in Peru. So the dictator, the president dictator, in 1942 started to see the writing on the wall and started to realize that the Axis was not going to win the war and that his global play was to join the Allies, which he did. So Brazil was a proto-fascist country, which became one of the Allies in 1942. One of the primary reasons that this was acceptable to the United States was that the north of Brazil became a location for air bases for US troops, especially going to North Africa. And again, if you imagine your map of the world, you'll realize how much closer Brazil is to Africa than, for example, the United States. Now, when this happened, immediately, Italian, German, and Japanese citizens in Brazil functionally became enemy aliens overnight, even if they'd been resident for decades. The Brazilian government did things like banned the speaking of foreign languages. So, for example, I have hundreds of cases of the Brazilian government, for example, trying to shut down Jewish schools in Brazil because they defined Yiddish, which is a language spoken by many East European Jews, was spoken by many East European Jews, as like a Nazi language, right? So the ironies are incredible. In the case of Japanese immigrants, you had another kind of odd set of circumstances. On the one hand, Japanese immigrants and their descendants were incredibly productive. I already mentioned the levels of commodity production on the Japanese colonies. And the Brazilian government in no way wanted that to stop. In addition, those colonies were in the middle of nowhere, had been set up functionally by the Japanese government, and the Brazilian government wasn't quite sure even how to deal with them. But over time, the Brazilian government started to crack down. And this crackdown led to what we might call a militant reaction among certain sectors of the rural Japanese immigrant population. How did that reaction take place? What happened was, over the final years of World War II, there started to develop an idea that Brazil was a colony of Japan, and that Japanese immigrants in Brazil were fighting for the Japanese Empire. This was the idea. It manifested itself in an organization called the Shindo Reme. And the Shindo proposed, especially after 1945, that Japan had won World War II. You heard me right. After 1945, that Japan had won World War II. Because of censorship laws in Brazil, it meant that this organization, for example, could easily pass large amounts of propaganda around the country. So, for example, Japanese immigrants regularly learned that the Japanese government had a secret bomb which had destroyed the entire US fleet. They regularly received photographs of US presidents or Douglas MacArthur bowing to the emperor and things like that, right? Now, one way we could think about this is they're all crazy, right? This is nuts. But I prefer to think of this as a way in which ethnicity is created. In a sense, Japanese immigrants are resisting the racism that was embedded in this government's approach to immigrants by kind of taking charge. Now, over time, about 100,000 Japanese immigrants and their descendants in Brazil had an affiliation with this movement. And by had an affiliation, I mean donated money, participated in rallies and things like that. Whether most of them believed that Japan had won World War II, let's say in 1947 or 1948, whether they still believed it is an open question. But what we do know is that some people moved from a kind of ethnic militancy to an armed militancy. And the photo you're seeing on the screen is one of the assassination squads. This photo is from, I think, 1949, that were used to attack Japanese immigrants who said openly that Japan had lost World War II, right? So I want you to imagine this situation, right? You have at the one hand, this kind of war going on between a group of Japanese immigrants and the Brazilian government. But at the same time, you have a kind of civil war going on among Japanese immigrants and Japanese Brazilians over the question of who won World War II. And this argument, this war, isn't happening just in 1945. It's happening in 1947 and 48 and 49. The Brazilian government didn't quite know what to do about it. And one of the most fascinating parts of the story is that in about 1950, key members of the Brazilian government set up a meeting with the leaders of this organization, a real meeting, and say at this meeting something like, tell us what we need to do to make this problem go away. We need you all to stop killing each other and burning down each other's farms and get back to work. And the leaders of the Shindo Reme say, it's simple. You need to stop this fake news that Japan lost World War II. Stop doing that, and we can move on. Even more incredible is that the Brazilian government says, fair enough. And starting in about 1950, all references to Japan's defeat are taken out of all official government documentation in Brazil and are censored in the press in Brazil. Right? So again, you heard it right. You're not hearing me wrong. So this is a really interesting way to think about World War II among Japanese immigrants and people of Japanese descent in the Brazilian case. Now, in fact, the tensions within the community continued. Even when I was doing my research in the late 1980s, for example, there were public spaces in which everybody knew that the old people who sat on that side were on one side of this story, and the people who sat on that side were another part of the story. But the thing really came to an end, this idea, the fake news, really came to an end in 1954. In 1954, this group of young men who you see here, swimmers, you see their feet in the pool, won a silver medal at the Olympics. They were known as the Flying Fish. And they were invited to Brazil to give exhibitions. Those exhibitions in Brazil were held in soccer stadiums, right? So I want you to imagine what that, this scene of these swimmers from Japan coming to Brazil and doing meets in front of 20, 30, 40,000 people, of whom huge numbers of them are of Japanese descent. After the first meet, the swimmers were interviewed by the Japanese-speaking press in Brazil. And one reporter who represented the group that said Japan had won World War II asked the young men a question that went as follows. It's wonderful to have you here in your colony, Brazil. Tell us how it feels to be traveling around the world with Japan as the world's greatest power in charge of everything. Now, these poor guys, it's 1954, so they've basically grown up in occupied Japan, kind of look at them and say, what are you talking about? Japan was destroyed. The US Army occupies us. There's nothing like that. And this was really the beginning of the end of this idea that Japan had won World War II. So I'm telling you this story to give you a kind of a different way of thinking about this era that's not just about racism as victimization. It's about thinking about race and racism in other ways. Now, I promised I'm going to not speak more than 30 minutes, so I just want to finish up quickly telling you a little bit about contemporary Japanese-Brazilian life, which, as I mentioned, there are more people of Japanese descent than anywhere else in the world. And there's a widespread joke here in Sao Paulo that the entire little Tokyo of Los Angeles would be called one block in the city of Sao Paulo, right? When you think about the numbers. So in contemporary Brazil, there is, of course, a great deal of racist discourse about people of Asian descent, although it tends to be positive stereotyping, model minority stereotyping, that has to do with working hard, being good at math. It's highly gendered. So, for example, there's a lot of ideas about women of Asian descent here in Brazil. An interesting statistic is one of the largest groups of people who have plastic surgery on their eyes are women of Japanese descent, so that they look less Japanese and thus believe that they'll be less subject to sexual harassment. There's also a sense in Brazil that Japanese-ness is something positive. And so I just want to show you a few things that in the United States would certainly be considered incredibly racist, but here are part of the visual landscape. So Simtoshiba, it doesn't exist. It it failed a few years ago, but through about 2015 was one of the largest Brazilian technology companies. Simtoshiba is not the same as Toshiba. And one of their most important campaigns was to pretend to be Japanese is easy. And you see here a person pretending to be Japanese. What's difficult to do is make a computer with such high technology. And you see that they do this with an Afro-Brazilian as Japanese, a Euro-Brazilian pulling the eyes back, right? What's a kind of classic example of racist activity. And here, a kind of gendered idea, right? Where you turn a man into a geisha. So I'm mentioning that to again suggest that it's not as simple as saying A or B, in the same way that I hope I've convinced you that between 1945 and 1954, it wasn't as simple as saying Japan lost or won World War II. And I think this happens in a place like Brazil because of the huge number of immigrants who came to this country, right? Immigration is discursively considered part of the founding of the country, similar to the way it is among many sectors of the United States. But also because of the huge population that came from Japan prior to World War II. And after World War II, there was another migration to Japan between about 1955 and 1970 of about 75,000 more people, new immigrants, that has created a kind of place or an idea of Japanese Brazilians as quite foundational to national identity. So with that, I think I'm going to stop, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or clear up any confusions that I've created. Thank you.
Great timing. Thank you so much for such a provocative talk. I know I have lots of questions. The chat has been fairly quiet. Why don't I give folks a chance to either raise a hand or start typing. I think I'll throw out one just to kind of get the conversation going. I think it's fascinating that there was essentially this is probably the earliest, maybe not the earliest fake news, but this is the biggest fake news story we can imagine, right? And the Brazilian government created the conditions for it through its censorship, right? So had they not dismantled the Brazilian, the Japanese newspapers, curtailed civil liberties, made it harder for schools to operate during World War II, there might have been more access to basic information. And so they created this vacuum that the organization then could create that other alternative narrative. And so I'm wondering if, rather than censor, there was actually discussion like maybe should we provide better access to information? Should we take the leadership to Japan so they can see what things actually look like for the Japanese? So I don't know if you want to comment on that as we give audience.
Sure. I mean, as is typical of right-wing regimes, both in the 1930s and in 2022, the idea of transparency is never discussed as something positive. So I've never found any indication that anybody ever said, let's undo the censorship. Let's have less censorship. Let's have more democracy. That never came up. It's interesting you mentioned about the question of Japan and going to Japan. One of the kind of oddities of this political situation was because Japan, after 1942, was an Axis enemy in Brazil, it had no official representation, right? It was an enemy country, which meant that through, I think, 1955, Japan was represented in Brazil by the Swiss government. And while maybe in the United States, we think of the Swiss as kind of paragons of honesty and whatever, you can imagine that a Japanese immigrant living in a rural space, upon seeing as he was once described, a tall, white, blonde European claiming that he was the one who represented Japan, nobody even believed it, right? That was their own version of fake news, right? So all of this kind of came together, and it's interesting that the story ends not through a government intervention. It ends, in a sense, by Japanese immigrants and Japanese Brazilians finding a way, with the arrival of these young swimmers, to start speaking to each other. The way, I mean, I didn't mention it, but basically what happened from that point forward was everybody agreed, let's stop talking about winners and losers. Let's start campaigns to help poor people and victims in Japan without kind of mentioning what the victimization was and what the poverty was. And that became a kind of resolution.
Very interesting. We've had a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is about the labor, the businesses that Japanese immigrants began, and part of the story I think is agriculture, but if you want to maybe expand a little bit on where their economic growth and their economic contributions really were apparent.
Sure. So absolutely, as I think you said the questioner suggested, economic growth came out of agricultural growth. The agricultural growth itself, I mean, is interesting because the Japanese colonies were on land that the Brazilian elite had determined incorrectly could never be valuable. So essentially what was happening was the Japanese government was coming in and buying for very little money huge plots of land that was considered unuseful. And it turns out that things that don't work under slavery, because slaves also have their own agency in these stories, work differently when you have free labor. And in this case, in a sense, the Japanese immigrants made these rural areas into highly productive agricultural plantations. I mentioned rice, but oranges, soy, often products that weren't being consumed internally in Brazil, but were sent looking to the export market. This was something new, right? In the Brazilian commercial mind, that there were things other than cotton and coffee that could be expanded. And then the other thing that's important is that the Japanese immigrant land owners or land workers were very committed to the education of their children. Their vision for their children was not that their children would stay on their land. Their vision was that their children would go to the city, get educated, and become doctors, lawyers, engineers, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was intense pressure to do that, not only among Japanese immigrants, but many immigrant groups. And it's one of the reasons that, for example, people from the United States are often surprised when they come to Sao Paulo to find that in areas like engineering, law, medicine, that the last names of people are frequently Jewish, Arab, and Japanese, right? And this all has to do with kind of immigrant parental pressures on native-born children for success.
Okay. There are a couple of questions that are about what life was like during World War II. I mean, I think that this is maybe part of the parallel of the discussions that we've had for other contexts. And so Charles Ozaki has a question about, you know, why weren't the Japanese Brazilians kidnapped and taken to the United States, or you know, why there wasn't a call for internment. I think you've offered some clues in your presentation, but maybe if you want to tease that out a little bit more. Oh, I think have you muted
sorry.
yourself?
Sorry.
Oh, now you're there. Okay.
Okay. So, I mean, I think questions about daily life are really hard to answer in aggregate because we're talking about a lot of people with a lot of different kinds of daily lives. So, for example, I mean, I focused on the story of rural people whose daily lives were in large part committed to shutting down discourses that Japan had lost World War II. However, there were Japanese Brazilians who were in the Brazilian army and were in Italy fighting with the Allies, right? That's another part of daily life. Another part of daily life was, it's exactly around World War II when you have the first Japanese Brazilian politicians coming to hold political power. Up to now, I've almost only talked about men. The lives of women were very, very different. Immigrant women, for example, in rural areas were part of the labor force. In urban areas, you had a kind of combination of highly educated Japanese Brazilian women who were often prevented from rising up in the labor force, and women who were either by choice or by force playing more traditional roles. So, I mean, I know I'm kind of avoiding the daily life question, but I think it's important that we don't kind of essentialize that there was one daily life. One thing that was likely part of daily life was that people of Japanese descent in their contacts with people of non-Japanese descent suffered regular prejudice and racism, although the forms of the prejudice and racism ranged between what I call negative stereotyping to positive stereotyping. These are all forms of prejudice and racism, right? In other words, saying to somebody, boy, you must be really smart is, as at least in my own way of thinking about it, is just as racist as saying, oh, you look like you're going to rob my house. But we're pretty sure that that was a regular part of interactions, as it is today. On the other hand, it's not that Japanese Brazilians spent all of their time in contact with non-Japanese Brazilians. And often those contacts were hierarchical, in which the Japanese Brazilians had the power. So, for example, by the 1940s, Japanese Brazilian landowners had the work on the land was being done by illiterate, poor Brazilians, generally of African descent, who the landowners themselves had prejudices and racism against.
And the question of internment, did it ever pop up?
Yeah, sorry, I should have, yeah.
Yeah.
So internment or concentration camps in the way that it happened in the United States did not happen. Furthermore, the story that we know from Peru of the US government essentially kidnapping Japanese Peruvians and taking them to the United States or other such things did not happen in Brazil. Now, one of the reasons that that didn't happen, now I can't talk about intent, but we know it didn't happen in part because the United States government was not in a position to invade Brazil, a huge country with a huge military, which was a military ally. And we do know that the dictator of Brazil made clear to the United States that it was not being given permission to come in and round up Japanese Brazilians. So I want to be, so again, making these kind of black and white distinctions is very hard in this case. Mm-hmm. Japanese Brazilians were, in a few cases, no, in a number of cases, moved out of areas that were considered strategic. That definitely happened. So that's not precisely internment. I'm not sure that that would be the word, but it is a kind of racism-based forced mobility. So we know that happened. A famous story was in the north of Brazil, in which the Brazilian government determined that an ice cream shop and its Japanese ice cream makers were too dangerous, and they were moved out of the major city in the Amazonian state where they lived. We also know that there were laws that were removing immigrants from leadership of businesses, nonprofits, etc. Although these were not only targeted towards people, Japanese immigrants. In other words, this was happening towards Germans, Italians, etc. And just one other small point on concentration camps or internment camps. They did exist in Brazil during World War I for Germans. So there were internment camps in Brazil for Germans.
Thank you. Michael Goodman has been very patient with a hand up.
Yeah, hello. This question is a little bit of an aside, but given your interesting remarks about a group of people that could not accept the results of a war, I think it's interesting to note that in Brazil, somewhere in the interior of Sao Paulo, there's a colony of descendants of American Confederates that went down to Brazil after the Civil War. And I think while they were aware of what the results were of the war, their idea was to implant the ideals of the Confederacy down there. And I believe their descendants are still alive, and they do commemorate some of their Confederate history. Thanks.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. It's a little bit different in that. I guess I wouldn't say that those U.S. Confederates came to Brazil to implant something in Brazil. They came to Brazil to take advantage of the fact that Brazil was still a slavocracy. And so they looked to Brazil and kind of said, those are our people. And you're absolutely correct that to this day, in that city, it's called Americana, right? Americanish or something like that, Americana. There is an annual celebration that has become increasingly controversial in Brazil with the growth of ethnic and racial civil rights movements here.
I see another question that's about the 1950s immigration wave. And I'm wondering if, you know, the push and pull of the 50s, I imagine, was different than that early wave. So if you could say a little something about that, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Yes, this 50s immigration wave is very interesting. So one thing I didn't mention, but would have if we were doing a semester-long course on Japanese immigration to Brazil, is unlike in much of the Japanese diaspora, in Brazil, the plurality of immigrants come from Okinawa. And so in the Brazilian context, Okinawan Brazilians have a kind of power within Japanese Brazilian groups that isn't found in, for example, the United States. That power manifested itself in many ways. One was that in the 1950s, with the US occupation of Okinawa, Okinawan Brazilians were in a position to call their relatives to Brazil, and that's where that 70,000 people kind of came from. And they came in to an internal ethnic world that was very Okinawan oriented. To this day, the largest number of Japanese Brazilian politicians are of Okinawan descent. And there's actually a very interesting theory, an ethnic identity theory here in Brazil, that Okinawan Brazilians are successful as being politicians because Okinawa is the kind of Brazil of Japan. And they talk about drinking, they talk about tropical climate, they talk about eating pork and things like that. Exactly, somebody's written here, Okinawans don't consider themselves Japanese. Exactly, precisely. And in the last 25 years, there's been a huge movement of Okinawan Brazilianness or identityness that's emerged here. It's partially done as a result of the Okinawan, the real Okinawa, own diaspora policies, which some people on this call may know about, lest you think it's unique to Okinawans. There are versions of these kind of come home things in the Jewish diaspora and the Arab diaspora and the Chinese diaspora, right? So I don't want to, again, essentialize Okinawans. And the most recent part of the phenomena here in Brazil has been the digging up of the bones of ancestors in Okinawa and reburying them in Brazil, which is kind of discursively understood as making Brazil into Okinawa, right? That Okinawa is where your ancestors are, not a geographical place determined by the Japanese government on a map. So so all of this is kind of related to that 1950s immigration and the fact that today you meet lots of immigrants who are from Okinawa. You don't meet that many living immigrants from 1920, but there are plenty of people who came between 1955 and 1974 to meet.
Fascinating. This was such a great and vibrant talk. I love the pictures. I think we've answered most of the questions and we're hitting up on the 3 o'clock mark here at Central Standard Time. I'll give it just one more minute to see if there's any other questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Lesser, for joining us today virtually, coming to us from Sao Paulo. It's always a pleasure to learn about this topic. It's personally fulfilling for me. I'm Sansei, 3rd generation Japanese Brazilian. So I always learn something when I read your work or when I get to hear you talk. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the audience for great questions. Our series is going to be available on our YouTube channel. And if you have other ideas for programming for CLACS, please feel free to send them our way. This program was organized by our center in collaboration with the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee and the Japanese American Citizens League Wisconsin chapter. So I thank our partners for also their participation. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.